Imagine you are a Roman soldier, not a general, not a senator, not a name that will appear in any history book. You are a legionary. You are 23 years old. You've been marching for 6 days through forests so dense the sky disappears at noon. Your sandals are soaked through. Your shield arm aches from holding the weight of your scutum at an angle to deflect the rain that has not stopped since the first day. The man in front of you is close enough that you can smell him. The man behind you is close enough to touch you if he stumbles. And the column, your column, the column of Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, general of 3 Roman legions, stretches so far behind you into the trees that you cannot see where it ends. Miles of men, miles of weapons, miles of mules and wagons and wives and servants, and everything that an army of the Roman Empire carries when it moves. You are invincible. That is not arrogance. That is simply fact. You are Rome. You have been trained since the age of 16. You have survived brutal physical conditioning that would break most men. You carry a pilum, a gladius, a full body of segmented armor, and the weight of 5 centuries of Roman military dominance. Your formation, the testudo, is a wall of shields that arrows cannot pierce. Your commanders have read Polybius, Caesar, and every tactical manual the ancient world has ever produced. Behind you stands the largest, most sophisticated military civilization the Western world has ever seen. Nothing in this forest can threaten you. That is what you believe. And then, somewhere in the trees to your left, you hear something. It is not loud. It is not even clear. It might be a branch. It might be rain hitting a boulder. It might be nothing at all. But something in your gut, something older than your training, something that goes back to whatever our ancestors were before we built cities, tells you it is not nothing. You are right. Within 72 hours, you will be dead. Nearly everyone around you will be dead. 3 entire Roman legions, the 17th, the 18th, the 19th, will cease to exist. Not defeated, not captured, obliterated. 15,000 soldiers, annihilated in the mud of a German forest, by an enemy that was never supposed to be capable of it. The Roman Empire will never fully recover from what is about to happen. And the man who engineered every second of it, the man whose genius, whose rage, whose breathtaking betrayal made all of it possible, is riding beside General Varus right now. He is trusted. He is admired. He is Roman-trained, Roman-educated, a Roman citizen by the emperor's own grant. His name is Arminius, and he has been planning this for years. To understand what was destroyed in the Teutoburg Forest, you first have to understand what Rome believed it was in the year 9 AD, because Rome in 9 AD was not a civilization experiencing self-doubt. Rome in 9 AD was a civilization at the absolute apex of its confidence. The Republic was dead. The wars that had torn apart. Caesar, Pompey, Brutus, Antony, the decades of blood and civil catastrophe, were a generation behind it. Augustus Caesar, the first true emperor, had forged from that wreckage something no Roman had ever seen. A unified, stable, prosperous, and aggressively expanding empire that stretched from the desert of Egypt to the moors of Scotland. The numbers alone are staggering. At its height, under Augustus, the Roman Empire governed somewhere between 50 million and 90 million people. That is roughly a quarter of the entire human population of the planet at that time. From the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the frontier of Mesopotamia, from the forests of northern Britain to the scorching sands of the Sahara, all of it administered, taxed, policed, and tied together by Roman roads, Roman law, Roman coinage, and Roman legions. The legions, let us stop there for a moment, because the Roman legion was not simply an army. It was one of the most sophisticated military institutions in human history, and in 9 AD, it was the undisputed master of the known world. A single legion numbered roughly 5,000 to 6,000 combat soldiers, organized into 10 cohorts, each cohort broken into 6 centuries of 80 men. Every century was commanded by a centurion, typically a hardened, experienced, professional soldier who had clawed his way up through the ranks and whose word was absolute law to the men beneath him. Roman soldiers did not just fight. They built. A Roman legion on the march erected a fully fortified camp every single night. Ditches, ramparts, wooden palisade, organized streets with designated areas for every function. They could construct bridges across wide rivers in days. They built roads that are still in use 2,000 years later. They operated siege engines, field artillery in the form of ballistae and onagers, and engineered assaults on fortified positions that other armies considered impregnable. Their battle formation, the manipular system adapted by the time of Augustus into the cohort system, was devastatingly effective on open ground. The discipline required to hold a Roman battle line under pressure, to advance in formation, to execute the complex maneuver of locking shields into a testudo while missiles rained down. That was not natural. It was drilled into soldiers over years of repetitive, grueling practice until it became reflex rather than thought. And Rome knew it. Rome was deeply proud of it. This pride was not vanity. It was evidence-based. In the century leading up to 9 AD, Roman legions had conquered Gaul under Julius Caesar, an enormous, sophisticated tribal society. In approximately 8 years, they had subjugated vast swaths of Iberia, North Africa, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. They had fought their way through deserts, across mountain ranges, across the Rhine and the Danube. Wherever the legions went, they had, with very few exceptions, won. This is a psychological atmosphere that produced Publius Quintilius Varus. Varus was not a military genius. History is not particularly kind to him, and in fairness, it should not be. But it is too easy, too convenient, to make him simply the villain of incompetence. The truth is that Varus was a completely typical product of the Roman aristocratic military administrative system. He was well-connected. He had married Augustus's grandniece. He was experienced in provincial administration, having governed Syria effectively for years. He was trusted by the emperor himself. What he was not, critically, was a soldier. He was an administrator who thought of military command as a natural extension of civil governance. And in most of the empire, in 9 AD, that was fine, because most of the empire was pacified. Most of the empire was, in Roman eyes, civilized. Germania was not. Let's be very precise about what Rome meant by Germania in 9 AD, because the word carries specific weight. The Rhine River had long been Rome's eastern boundary in the northwest. On the western bank, Roman territory, Romanized Gaul, civilization. On the eastern bank, Germania, dense, almost pathologically impenetrable forest. Tribes whose names Rome had catalogued. The Cherusei, the Bructeri, the Marsi, the Chauci, but whose internal politics, whose allegiances, whose geography Rome understood only poorly. No cities, no roads, no network of infrastructure that Rome could plug into and control. Just trees, rivers, hills, and people who had no interest in becoming Roman. Rome had been pushing into this territory for years before 9 AD. Augustus's stepson Drusus, one of the most brilliant Roman commanders of his generation, had conducted aggressive campaigns east of the Rhine in the decade before the turn of the century, penetrating deep into the German interior, winning significant battles, and appearing to make genuine progress toward the conquest and pacification of a territory Rome had begun to call province. The future province of Germania, another jewel in the imperial crown. Drusus died in 9 BC, a riding accident, far from home, deep in the east, before the project was complete. His brother Tiberius, the future emperor, continued the campaigns, and by 9 AD, there was genuine Roman optimism that Germania was coming under control. Roman auxiliaries were being recruited from Germanic tribes. Germanic aristocrats were being educated in Rome, given citizenship, integrated into the Roman administrative system. It seemed to be working. Varus arrived in Germania as governor, the first real governor, treating it as a pacified province rather than an active theater of war around 6 or 7 AD. And here we arrive at the first of several fatal miscalculations. Varus behaved in Germania the way a Roman governor behaved in a pacified province. He established courts. He imposed taxes. He administered Roman law to Germanic peoples who had never asked for Roman law, and who had their own deeply rooted legal and social traditions that Roman taxation and Roman courts directly undermined. He did not do this with exceptional cruelty. He did it with the casual, complete confidence of a man who assumes that what he is doing is obviously correct, obviously beneficial, and will be obviously recognized as such by the people receiving it. He was wrong. There had already been a rebellion, a serious one, Between 6 and 9 AD, a confederation of Pannonian and Dalmatian tribes east of the Adriatic had risen against Roman rule in what became known as the Great Illyrian Revolt. It took 3 years and some of Rome's best legions to suppress it. Augustus himself reportedly told the Senate it was the most dangerous crisis since the wars with Hannibal. It was a preview, a warning that even tribes already incorporated into the Roman system could break. Varus did not take the warning personally enough. And so in the late summer of 9 AD, Varus prepared to march his 3 legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, from their summer encampment in interior Germania back toward their winter quarters on the Rhine. A routine movement, a march they had made before. 3 full legions, 3 cavalry units called aili, 6 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, support personnel, engineers, servants, civilian camp followers, families. The total column, by most estimates, numbered somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people, strung out along roads, or what passed for roads in the German forest, that were narrow, often unmarked, and surrounded on both sides by trees and hills and terrain that Rome had never fully mapped. Here's what Varus did not know. Someone had been watching him for months, studying his patterns, calculating his route, identifying every geological choke point along the path his column would have to travel, assessing every moment of vulnerability, planning, with extraordinary precision, a massacre so complete that Rome would struggle to believe it had happened. And that someone had been riding alongside Varus the entire time, eating dinner at his table, laughing at his jokes, trusted absolutely. We need to talk about Arminius. There is a statue in the forests of northern Germany. It has stood since 1875 on a hill in the Teutoburg Forest region, and it is enormous, 53 meters tall from base to the tip of its sword. The figure depicts as muscular, defiant, armored, holding a broadsword raised toward the sky. The inscription on the base reads in German, Germany's liberator. The man in the statue is Arminius. And here's the first strange, deeply human thing about him. The name Arminius is almost certainly not what his mother called him. It is a Latinized version of something Germanic, possibly Ermanaz, meaning something close to the Great One or the Whole One. But he grew up answering to both. He moved through 2 worlds so completely, so fluently, that for years no one, not the Romans, not necessarily his own people, could say for certain which world he truly belonged to. That ambiguity was not accidental, and it was not comfortable. It was the crucible that made him. To understand Arminius, you have to understand a specific Roman practice that is not often discussed, but that shaped the politics of the frontier for generations. Rome had a sophisticated, if ruthless, method for managing recently conquered or allied tribal territories. They took hostages, not hostages in the medieval sense. Chained in dungeons, held as leverage under threat of execution, Roman hostages of the aristocratic class were treated quite differently. They were brought to Rome, educated in Roman schools, taught Latin, trained in Roman military tactics and philosophy and rhetoric, integrated into Roman social circles. They were, in essence, Romanized. The calculation was elegant and cold. If you educate the next generation of tribal leadership inside Rome, they become culturally Roman. They go back to their people as administrators who think like Romans, govern like Romans, and create Romanized territories without Rome ever having to fight for them. It worked often. It worked on many of the men who went through that system. It did not work on Arminius. Arminius was born around 17 BC, the son of Segimerus, a chieftain of the Cherusei tribe, one of the most significant Germanic tribes east of the Rhine, occupying territory in what is now roughly central Germany. The Cherusei were not a small or irrelevant people. They were well-established, organized, and had maintained a complex and often tense relationship with Rome's expanding frontier for decades. As part of the ongoing Roman policy of managing the Germanic tribes through the integration of their elites, Arminius and possibly his brother Flavius. Yes, his brother's name means a blonde in Latin, which tells you something about how completely some of these men adopted Roman identity, were sent to Rome as child hostages. Arminius was likely around 10 years old. Think about that for a moment, not abstractly. Humanly, a 10-year-old boy, taken from his tribe, from his language, from the landscape he knew, from whatever gods his family worshipped. from the sound of his mother tongue, and transported to the largest city on earth, a city of perhaps 1 million people. In an era when most humans lived in communities of a few hundred, the noise alone would have been overwhelming. The scale, the stone, the endless, crushing density of Roman civilization pressing in from every direction. Rome in the Augustan era was breathtaking and brutal simultaneously. The Forum, the temples, the Palatine Hill crown with the emperor's residence, the Circus Maximus, where 250,000 people could watch chariot races, the aqueducts carrying millions of gallons of water daily. It was a civilization that announced its own greatness at every turn, in stone and marble in the organized spectacle of power. For a Germanic tribal boy, arriving from a world of wooden longhouses and forest clearings, it was incomprehensible. And then they put him in school. He learned Latin, then Greek. He studied military history, tactics, philosophy. He trained physically in a Roman manner, the drills, the formations, the weapons. He was by every account extraordinarily gifted, smart, physically exceptional, charismatic. He moved up to the Roman auxiliary military system, the pathway for non-citizens who wanted to serve, with a speed that attracted the attention of powerful Romans. At some point, he was granted Roman citizenship, equestrian rank, the second tier of the Roman social hierarchy, the rank of the business class, the minor nobility. This was a significant honor, not routinely given to anyone, let alone a Germanic auxiliary officer. It meant Arminius had been seen, evaluated, and judged worthy by the Roman system at its highest levels. He served in the Roman army, almost certainly in Pannonia or along the Danube frontier, during exactly the years of the Great Illyrian Revolt, meaning he would have witnessed firsthand what a coordinated anti-Roman tribal uprising actually looked like when it nearly succeeded. He would have watched Roman commanders assess the terrain, plan their responses, make their mistakes. He would have learned with a Roman officer's analytical eye exactly how Rome fought and exactly where Rome was vulnerable. He came back to Germania around 6 or 7 AD. He came back as a Roman officer, a Roman citizen, a man fluent in every dimension of Roman military and political culture. And here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because nobody knows, and nobody will ever know with certainty, exactly when Arminius decided. Was it something that had been building since childhood? A slow, cold fire beneath the Romanized exterior? Was it the specific experience of returning to his people and seeing, with fresh eyes, what Roman administration actually meant for the Cherusci? Was it the taxes Varus imposed? The humiliation of watching Germanic freemen subjected to Roman legal proceedings that made no sense in their cultural framework? Was it personal? Something done to someone he loved, some specific act of Roman arrogance that crystallized years of suppressed identity into a single point of rage? We do not know. The ancient sources give us results, not psychology. We have Cassius Dio, writing more than a century after the fact. We have Tacitus, who is richer but still working from sources at a remove. We have no Arminius memoir, no letters, no confession. What we know is this. Sometime before 9 AD, Arminius began organizing, and the way he organized tells us everything about who he was. He did not ride into the tribal assembly of the Cherusci and give a speech about freedom. He did not try to unite all the Germanic tribes in a grand alliance. He knew Rome well enough to know that visible, large-scale military preparation would be detected and crushed. He operated on a principle that any intelligence professional in any era would recognize: compartmentalization. Each piece of the plan was known only to those who absolutely needed to know it. The full picture existed only in his own mind. He recruited carefully. He brought in key leaders from several tribes, the Bructeri, the Marsi, the Chauci, among others. He explained enough to secure their commitment without revealing the whole architecture. And he maintained his position inside Varus's inner circle throughout, continuing to perform the role of trusted Germanic ally with, as far as anyone could tell, perfect fidelity. His own family was split by his decision. His uncle Inguiamarus, a powerful Cherusci chieftain, joined the conspiracy, but his father-in-law, Seges, did not. Seges was one of the Cherusci leaders who had committed genuinely and deeply to the Roman alliance, not as performance, but as a real political conviction. He believed Rome was the future, He believed Arminius was walking his people toward destruction, and Segest did something remarkable. He warned Varus, not once, multiple times. Before the march into the forest, Segest went to Varus and told him directly, Arminius is planning a revolt. The Germanic auxiliaries cannot be trusted. The route is compromised. Do not march. Varus did not believe him. This is one of the most painful details in the entire story, because it is so completely human. Varus's dismissal of Segest was not stupid in isolation. It made a certain kind of sense within the logic of his world. Segest had a personal grievance against Arminius. Arminius had, in an act of extraordinary boldness, even by ancient standards, abducted and married Segest's daughter, thus Nelda, against her father's wishes. So when Segest accused Arminius of conspiracy, Varus heard it filter through the obvious lens of a personal feud between two Germanic nobles. Family drama, tribal politics, not credible intelligence. He also simply could not conceive of Arminius as a threat. This was a man he knew, a man he had dined with, a Roman officer, a Roman citizen, a man educated in Rome's own finest traditions. The idea that this man, this familiar, trusted, culturally Roman companion, was secretly and systematically engineering the destruction of 3 legions was simply too large a cognitive leap for Varus to make. Roman arrogance was not just political, it was deeply, structurally personal. The Romans had a concept they called imperium, the authority, the right, the civilizational mandate to rule. An imperium was not merely a political claim. It was a psychological one. It made certain kinds of betrayal literally unthinkable, because the Roman mind, at that level of the hierarchy, could not fully imagine that someone who had been given the gift of Roman civilization would genuinely choose to destroy it. Arminius counted on exactly that. There's one more thing about Arminius that deserves to be said, because it complicates the statue on the hill, and because complexity is what separates real history from myth. Arminius was not fighting for a united Germany. Germany as a concept did not exist. He was fighting for the Cherusci. He was fighting for himself. He was fighting against Roman domination of his people's territory, yes, but the coalition he built was fragile, tribal, and deeply personal. After the battle, he would spend the rest of his life fighting, not just against Rome, but against other Germanic leaders, against rivals, against his own uncle, against the political consequences of being a man who had done the impossible but could not control what came after. He was assassinated around 21 AD by members of his own tribe, by men who feared that the power he had accumulated in defeating Rome was now becoming a threat to their own freedom. He was approximately 37 years old. He never saw his son. His wife, thus Nelda, was captured by the Romans, taken by her own father Segest, who handed her over to Tiberius as a peace offering. And she gave birth to their child in Roman captivity, a boy named Teutoburg, who was raised Roman, trained as a gladiator, and disappears from the historical record before the age of 20. Another child taken, another generation folded into the empire. The irony is almost unbearable, but all of that is aftermath. All of that is what happens after Forest. First, there's a forest. In the late summer of 9 AD, Arminius has been waiting for months, watching the Roman column prepare for its march west toward the Rhine and winter quarters. He knows the route. He knows the terrain. He has chosen the killing ground, the precision of a man who has walked it, measured it, and imagined the slaughter in every detail. There is one final element he needs. A reason for Varus to deviate from the safest path. A reason to take the column into the deep forest, rather than staying on the more open routes near the Rhine tributaries. Something plausible. Something that will make tactical sense to a Roman governor who trusts him. A false report of a tribal uprising in the interior. A problem that needs addressing. A small diversion from the main route to handle it, and then back on track. Varus believed it. The column turned east, into the Teutoburg Forest, into the trap. There's a word in German, Hinterhalt. It translates roughly as ambush, but the literal construction of the word is more precise than that. Hinter means behind. Halt means stop or hold. A Hinterhalt is not simply an attack from hiding. It is a holding back, a waiting, a stillness that precedes violence with the deliberateness of a held breath. Arminius had been holding his breath for years. And what he built in the forest east of the Rhine was not simply an ambush in the way we typically imagine ambushes, a handful of men behind trees, a sudden volley of arrows, a quick raid. What he built was an architecture of destruction, a carefully engineered killing ground that exploited every single advantage the natural world offered and neutralized every single advantage Rome possessed. To understand how he did it, you have to understand the terrain. And to understand the terrain, you have to spend a moment really imagining what the German interior looked like in 9 AD, because it was nothing like the managed, accessible forests of modern Germany, crisscrossed with footpaths and signposted trails and picnic areas. Ancient Germania was, by every Roman account that survives, a landscape that inspired something close to primal dread. It was vast. It was dark. The canopy was so dense in places that travelers reported riding for days without seeing the sky clearly. The undergrowth was thick and tangled. The rivers ran fast and cold and changed course seasonally without warning, creating sudden boggy ground and hidden marsh where the map, if a map even existed, showed solid land. The hills were not dramatic mountain ranges, but something in many ways more confusing, a constant rolling, disorienting succession of ridges and valleys and sudden drops that made it nearly impossible to maintain directional sense or any kind of organized formation over distance. The Romans hated it. This is not an embellishment. Roman writers describe the German forest with consistency of language that borders on pathological, impenetrable, hostile, alien. There's a genuine undertone of existential unease in the way Roman authors wrote about Germania, as though the forest itself was a kind of affront to Roman order, a place where the civilizational rules simply did not apply. They were right, and Arminius knew exactly why. The Roman military machine was engineered for open ground, every element of its superiority. The formations of discipline, the coordinated advance, the interlocking shields, the devastating short-range effectiveness of the pilum thrown in volleys before the gladius charge, required space. It required room for the formation to breathe, to maneuver, to respond. It required soldiers who could see their officers, hear the commands, dress their lines, hold their intervals. In dense forests, in narrow ravines, in boggy ground that swallowed feet to the ankle with every step. None of that worked. You could not hold a formation in single file on a path barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. You cannot throw Pila effectively when the trees are close enough to catch the shafts mid-flight. You cannot receive cavalry support when the horses cannot move faster than a walk without stumbling. You cannot use your tactical intelligence when you cannot see 10 meters in front of you. Arminius had watched Roman legions operate in open terrain for years. He knew their power intimately, and he had concluded, with the cold precision of a man who had been educated in the very doctrine he was planning to destroy, that the way to defeat Rome was not to fight Rome. It was to deny Rome the battlefield that made Rome undefeatable. The location he selected is believed, based on the archaeological work we will discuss later, to have been an area now known as Caugries, in the Osnabrück region of what is today Lower Saxony. The precise geography of the killing ground is remarkable and not accidental. Picture it. A narrow corridor of passable ground, perhaps 100 to 150 meters wide at its broadest points, running between 2 natural barriers. On one side, rising sharply to the south, a series of forested ridges and hills, the Wienberg Range, densely wooded, providing perfect elevated cover for warriors who knew every fold in the ground. On the other side, to the north, the Caugries Moor, a great marshland, impassable, a wall of saturated ground that no column of men in formation could cross, that cavalry could not penetrate, that would swallow any attempt to flank or escape to the north as surely as if it were the sea. Between these 2 walls, the forested hills and the marsh, a narrow passage, and through this passage, the Roman road, such as it was, had to pass. There was no alternative route. To get through this section of the march, Varus's entire column, 15,000 to 20,000 people, miles long, had compressed itself into this bottleneck and moved through it slowly, in a long, vulnerable, strung-out line. Arminius had not just found this landscape, he had modified it. This is one of the details that becomes clear from the archaeological excavations at Caugries, and it elevates Arminius from opportunist to military architect. Along the line of the southern hills, his warriors had constructed a turf wall, not a permanent fortification. Nothing that Roman scouts, if they were doing their jobs, might have noticed from a distance and reported. This was a field construction, built from the earth and sod of the hillside itself, low enough to blend into the natural terrain, but high enough to provide cover for men crouching behind it, elevated enough to give them a firing position over the path below. Think about the logistics of this. Arminius had to organize enough men, hundreds, possibly thousands of workers, to construct this wall without the Romans learning of it. He had to do it in secret, in a forest that Roman patrols theoretically moved through, in a landscape that Varus presumably believed was under Roman observation. He had to coordinate the construction, the concealment, the timing, the positioning of warriors from multiple different tribes who did not all share language, who had different tribal loyalties, and who had never executed a coordinated military operation at this scale. And he did it. The Germanic warriors waiting behind that wall and up in those forested hills were not an undisciplined mob, the way Rome tended to depict its barbarian enemies. They were men who knew this ground the way they knew their own homes, who had hunted these hills since childhood, who understood where the soft ground was, where the sight lines opened, where a man could move quickly, and where movement would be heard. They were fast. They were physically adapted to this terrain in ways a sandal-wearing, formation-dependent legionary was not. They carried from lighter Germanic spears and long slashing swords. They wore minimal armor, which meant they were agile in ways armored Romans simply were not. Most critically, they did not need to beat Rome in a straight fight. They only needed to kill Romans faster than Romans could adapt. Arminius had built a machine for doing exactly that, but the machine was only as good as its trigger, and the trigger was Arminius himself. In the days before the march into the killing ground, Arminius was still riding with Varus, still eating at the general's table, still advising on the route, the pace, the disposition of forces. He was present for the planning conversations. He knew the order of march, which legions were in the lead, where the cavalry was positioned, where the supply wagons were clustered, where the most vulnerable non-combat personnel were concentrated in the column. He shared some of this information with the men waiting in the hills, but not all of it, because Arminius still needed one more thing from his position inside Varus's command structure. He needed the column to be fully committed to the corridor before the attack began. He needed the vanguard to be deep enough inside the killing ground that it could not simply turn around. He needed the rear guard to have entered far enough that the entire column was simultaneously inside the trap. He needed the wagons, heavy, slow, blocking the path in both directions, to be positioned so that retreat was as impossible as advance. Timing. It was all timing. There is also the matter of the weather. September in northwestern Germany is not the temperate, mild autumn of the tourist brochures. In 9 AD as now, late September could bring sustained, heavy rainfall that turned forest paths into streams and open ground into bog. Roman sources, Cassius Dio, writing his account over a century later but drawing on early material, are consistent on this point. The weather during the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was terrible. Rain that did not stop. Wind that drove it sideways through the trees. Ground that became progressively more treacherous with every hour of the column's march. Whether Arminius chose his timing to coincide with the weather, or whether the weather was simply the misfortune that amplified every other disadvantage the Romans were already facing, is unknown. What is certain is that the rain played a decisive role in what happened. It made the path slippery. It reduced visibility. It dampened the gut strings of Roman bows and the leather bindings of equipment. It turned the already narrow margin of the corridor into a sucking, ankle-deep nightmare. It also muffled sound. In a forest already dense enough to distort acoustics, sustained heavy rain creates a continuous white noise, a constant background roar of water on leaves, water on ground, water on armor, that drowns out the sound of careful movement. The sound of hundreds of men shifting quietly into position behind a turf wall. The sound of a warrior adjusting his grip on a spear. The low murmur of instructions passed down a battle line. Arminius may not have controlled the weather, but he used it. Now consider the psychological dimension of what he had engineered, because it deserves its own moment. Varus's column had been marching for days. It was tired. It was wet. It was uncomfortable in a particular grinding way of men who have been cold and damp for long enough that they have stopped thinking about being warm and dry and are simply enduring. The mood in a column like that is not fear. It is not even really alertness. It is a kind of numb, forward-leaning endurance, a focus purely on the next step, the next mile, the next camp, the vigilance that a soldier should maintain, the active, outward scanning for threat, fades when men are wet and tired and moving to ground that their commanders have told them is pacified. This is not a criticism of the soldiers. It is human nature. It is a specific vulnerability that sustained, grinding marching creates in even the most disciplined force. Arminius knew this. He had marched with Roman columns himself. He had felt it. There is one final element to the trap that is easy to overlook, but was possibly its most sophisticated component. Arminius did not simply wait for the column to enter the killing ground and then attack. He had, in the days and weeks before the march, systematically removed whatever early warning capability Varus might have had. Germanic scouts and informants who were loyal to Rome, and there were some men like Segestus who genuinely supported the Roman alliance, were isolated, discredited, or in some cases simply not in a position to observe what was being prepared. The Germanic auxiliaries within Varus's own column, men who might have had the cultural knowledge and linguistic ability to read the landscape for warning signs, were, according to at least one ancient account, quietly encouraged to separate from the column before the attack, to slip away in ones and twos in the days leading up to the moment, to not be present when the killing started. This matters enormously, because it means that when the column entered the forest and the trail narrowed and the hills closed in and the marsh pushed from the north, there was nobody in that column who could look at the landscape with the right eyes. Nobody who could look at the forested ridge to the south and see, in particular stillness of it, not the absence of threat, but the presence of men holding themselves very still. Varus was effectively blind, and on a day in late September of 9 AD, the exact date is lost to history, Arminius found a reason to leave the column. Perhaps he said he was going ahead to coordinate with allied Germanic warriors. Perhaps he gave some entirely routine military excuse. Perhaps he simply rode away and Varus did not think twice about it, because Arminius had been giving him reasons that required no thought for years. He rode up into the forested hills. He joined his warriors. He looked down at the long snake of Rome's finest army winding slowly through the narrow corridor below, and he gave the signal. The first Firmea struck a Roman soldier, somewhere near the middle of the column, then another, and then from a forested ridge line and from behind the turf wall and from the trees on both sides of the path, the sound that had been suppressed for weeks and months and years broke open all at once. Thousands of voices, in a language Varus could not speak, screaming. The first thing that killed Romans in the Teutoburg Forest was not a spear. It was a column itself. To understand why, you have to hold the image clearly in your mind. A Roman marching column of 15,000 to 20,000 people does not look like an army in battle formation. It looks like a city moving through a forest. It is long, extraordinarily, almost incomprehensibly long. Historians and military analysts who have worked through the mathematics of Varus's column estimate that, given the width of the available path and the number of men, animals, wagons, and support personnel involved, the full column may have stretched somewhere between 15 and 20 kilometers from its vanguard to its rear guard. 15 to 20 kilometers. On a path through dense forest, in heavy rain, in single or double file. That means when the attack began near the middle of the column, the soldiers at the very front had no idea what was happening. The soldiers at the very back had no idea what was happening. The screaming, the crashing of weapons, the sudden eruption of chaos. All of it was happening somewhere in the middle of the line so long that the sound was swallowed by the rain and the trees before it reached the extremities. In a modern military context, this is called loss of command and control. In 9 AD, it was simply called death. The Romans in the killing zone, wherever the initial contact was heaviest, did what Roman soldiers were trained to do. They attempted to form up. They turned toward the threat. They called for the centurions, their options, their standard bearers. They tried to create order from the sudden violence, because order was what Roman soldiers were made of. Without it, they were not an army. They were just people with weapons. But the path was too narrow. The trees were too close. The men were pressed together so tightly that swinging a gladius, a weapon designed for close-quarter thrusting in a disciplined line, was nearly impossible without hitting the man next to you. The pilum, Rome's devastating throwing spear, required space to generate the running step and throwing motion that gave its lethal velocity. Here there was no space. There was only the crush of men trying to turn, trying to see, trying to find the enemy, and finding instead the trees throwing spears back at them. The Firmea was a Germanic warrior's primary weapon, and in this context, it was devastatingly well suited to what was required. Lighter than a Roman pilum, with a smaller iron head but a shaft of carefully selected tight-grained ash, it could be thrown hard and fast from behind cover, from elevation, through gaps in the tree line, at ranges that meant the thrower was never fully exposed. You did not need to be in the open. You did not need to charge. You threw from the ridge. You threw from behind the turf wall. You threw from the trees on the opposite side of the path. And then you moved sideways along the ridge to a new position, and you threw again. The Romans had no target. The attack came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. A man goes down to your left. You turn. A spear comes from the right. You raise your shield. Another comes from above. The standard formation response to missile fire, the testudo, the tortoise, shields locked overhead, and at the sides to form an impenetrable shell, was physically impossible in the crush of the column. You needed space to execute a testudo. You needed the men around you to be in position, aware, coordinated. In the chaos of the first minutes, none of those conditions existed. And then there were the wagons. The wagons were perhaps the single most catastrophic non-human element of the disaster on day one. A Roman column of this size carried an enormous logistical tale. Food, equipment, artillery components, personal effects, the belongings of the civilian camp followers, the treasury for 3 legions. All of this moved on wheeled vehicles pulled by mules or oxen, heavy, slow, wide enough that they significantly narrowed the already narrow path. When the attack began, the animals panicked, and they panicked immediately, because animals always do. The wagons jackknifed. They overturned. They blocked the path in both directions. Men behind the wagons could not advance to reinforce men in front. Men in front could not fall back to the obstruction. The wagons became walls, but not the kind Rome knew how to fight behind. Random walls, obstacle walls, walls that divided the column into isolated sections that could not support each other. A legionary in one of those isolated sections looked around him and saw the same thing in every direction. Trees, rain, bodies, chaos, and no clear enemy to kill. Now add the centurions. The centurion was the spine of the Roman legion, not the legate, not the tribunes. The centurion, the professional soldier who had earned his vine staff through decades of service, who knew every man in his century by name, who was a living embodiment of Roman military doctrine and discipline. A good centurion could hold his century together in conditions that would dissolve any other unit. His presence, his voice, his absolute authority was a mechanism through which Roman discipline functioned in the chaos of battle. Arminius knew this, and the warriors on the ridge had been instructed. The ancient sources suggest this, and it is tactically logical enough to be credible, to target the centurion specifically. The transverse crest on a Roman centurion's helmet, the horizontal red plume that ran ear to ear rather than front to back, was a battlefield identifier visible from a distance. It was designed to help soldiers find their commanders quickly in the confusion of close combat in the Teutoburg Forest. It also made those commanders clearly identifiable targets for men throwing spears from elevated cover. The centurions died at a disproportionate rate. Every centurion who fell was not just one man lost. It was an anchor of order pulled from the seafloor. The century he commanded became, in that instant, significantly more likely to dissolve, to lose cohesion, to begin acting as individuals rather than as a unit, to fragment and scatter and die piecemeal in the trees. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Varus was trying command. We cannot know exactly what Varus experienced in those first hours of the ambush, but we can reconstruct the broad shape of it from what Roman commanders in similar situations reported, from what the terrain demanded, and for what the sources tell us of his ultimate decisions. He would have received fragmentary, contradictory reports. Riders coming back from different parts of the column with different, incompatible accounts of where the attack was heaviest, how many enemies were engaged, what the situation on the flanks looked like. In the rain and the trees and the noise, accurate intelligence was essentially impossible to gather and essentially impossible to transmit. What Varus needed, in that moment, was what every Roman general needed in a crisis: high ground, clear sight lines, and an open field in which to form his legions in battle order and let the Roman military machine do what was built to do. He had none of those things. He had a narrow, tree-choked path in a rainstorm, a column strung out over kilometers, panicking wagons blocking movement in both directions, and an enemy that struck and vanished and struck again before the shields could be raised. The early hours of day one were not a battle in any Roman sense of the word. They were a sustained, coordinated assassination of order. And yet, and this matters, the Romans did not simply collapse. This is a crucial point, and it is one that sometimes gets lost in the telling of Teutoburg, because the outcome is so catastrophic that there is a temptation to read the whole event as a simple, swift slaughter. It was not. The legionaries of the 17th, 18th, and 19th were elite, professional soldiers. They were frightened and confused and suffering terrible casualties, but they did not break and run immediately. They did what Romans did. They fought. Where small groups found a moment of clarity, a cleared section of path, a natural defensive position, a centurion still standing and shouting orders, they formed up and fought. They moved toward the sound of command. They protected each other. Roman discipline, even in conditions it was never designed for, created pockets of fierce, determined resistance. Individual sentries, individual cohorts, held themselves together and extracted real cost from the Germanic warriors who came too close. There are suggestions in the sources, and again the sources are imperfect, but they are what we have, that some Roman units attempted proactive responses, trying to push up the hillside toward the attackers, trying to clear the ridge, trying to turn the ambush into a conventional engagement where Roman training could take effect. These attempts failed largely because the terrain destroyed formation cohesion the moment men left the path and tried to climb through the undergrowth toward the ridge. They became individuals in the trees, alone, fighting men who were at home in those trees. And individuals died. The cavalry, theoretically Rome's most mobile and potentially disruptive force in a situation like this, was almost completely neutralized. The narrow path, the soft ground soaked by days of rain, the trees pressing it on both sides. There was nowhere for cavalry to operate. A Roman horse soldier in that corridor could not charge, could not maneuver, could not use speed, the one advantage that made cavalry terrifying. They were simply large, visible targets elevated above the foot soldiers, exposed, unable to deliver the devastating shock assault that justified their existence. Some cavalry units did manage to break out. Small groups of riders who found gaps in the attack, who pushed through, who escaped the corridor entirely. These men would eventually bring the first news of the disaster back toward the Rhine. Their escape was not courage and not cowardice. It was the brutal arithmetic of terrain. The horses could go where they could go, and some of those places led away from the killing ground. By the time the light began to fail on day one, and in a dense German forest in late September, the light fails early, the canopy darkening from green-black to just black well before the sun actually sets. Varus had made a decision. He could not fight his way through this. Not today. Not in this terrain. Not with his column fragmented and his casualties already heavy, and his supply wagons blocking the road in both directions. He would make camp. This decision is often criticized, and it is possible to see why. Stop and give the enemy time to prepare, time to reinforce, time to choose the next point of attack. But it is also, given the alternatives, defensible. A Roman fortified camp, even hastily constructed, was a significant defensive structure. The legionaries' training included the rapid construction of field fortifications under pressure, ditch, rampart, palisade. Inside that perimeter, with the men gathered, with some semblance of order restored, with officers able to assess casualties and reorganize units, Varus might hope to present a coherent defensive position, and either fight his way out the following day, or wait for relief. The camp they built that first night was not the perfect, regulation standard Roman camp of the training manuals. It was reduced in size, probably, to account for the diminished available ground. It was rushed. Some of the wagons they could not move they burned. The first fires of the night, orange light through the rain in the trees, visible probably to the warriors watching from the hills. The burning of the wagons tells you something about Varus's state of mind. He was shedding weight, acknowledging that the campaign, as he had planned it, was over, that the only question now was survival and extraction. Inside the camp that night, in the firelight and the rain, the Romans assessed what had happened to them. The numbers are not precisely known, but they were terrible. Hundreds dead in the first day's attack, certainly. Perhaps more. Centurions above all, the backbone of the legions, dead at a rate that left whole centuries without experienced leadership. Wounded men who would slow the column further tomorrow. Ammunition and water, and food already under pressure. Morale, that invisible but absolutely critical component of any fighting force, damaged in a way that drill and discipline could partially restore, but not fully repair. The men who had been in the worst of the fighting knew something that their commanders perhaps did not yet fully admit. This was not a raid. This was not a local uprising that could be chased down and punished. This was organized. This was massive. This was prepared. Somebody had known exactly where they were going to be and exactly how to destroy them. Some of them, perhaps, had begun to think about Arminius, about where he had gone, about what his absence meant. Some of them knew. The rain continued through the night. In the forested hills above the camp, the Germanic warriors rested, resupplied, repositioned. Arminius moved among them. The ancient sources present him, in this phase of the battle, as fully in command, directing, coordinating, managing the extraordinary challenge of keeping a coalition of multiple tribes focused on a single objective against an enemy that, even wounded and disorganized, was still the most dangerous fighting force in the world. What he said to his men that night we do not know, but they were still there in the morning. Dawn came gray and wet and cold, and Varus gave the order to march. He had chosen a direction, northwest, toward the Rhine, towards safety, through terrain that was marginally more open than the killing ground of the previous day. The decision was logical. He could not stay where he was. He could not fight his way back the way he had come. Forward, toward the Rhine, was the only option that offered any hope. What he did not know, what Arminius had ensured he would not know, was that the terrain ahead of him was not marginally more open. It was worse. The warriors who had pulled back from the ridge the previous night had not dispersed. They had moved, parallel to the Roman column, faster than the column could march, through ground they knew perfectly. They had repositioned, forward to the next choke point, to the next narrowing of the corridor between the hills and the marsh, to the next place where the path squeezed into something barely wider than a wagon's axle, where the trees came down to the edge of the road, where the ground in the north was soft enough to swallow a man's foot before he could pull it free. They were already there when the Roman column began to emerge from the camp. Day 2 was waiting, and it was going to be worse than day 1. There is a particular kind of despair that is specific to men who were brave yesterday and know they have to be brave again today. It is not cowardice. It is something colder and more corrosive than cowardice. It is the knowledge, the body's knowledge, deeper than thought, that what happened yesterday is going to happen again, that the enemy is still out there, that the terrain is still wrong, that the advantages you were trained to rely on are still absent, that the men who died yesterday are not coming back, and the men still alive are carrying the weight of that knowledge into every step of this morning's march. The Roman legionaries who filed out of their hastily constructed camp on the morning of day 2 were not broken men. Not yet, but they were changed men. The psychological contract that Roman military training made with its soldiers, the implicit promise that if you hold your formation, follow your orders, trust your discipline, Rome's system will protect you. That contract had taken serious damage in the previous day's killing. It was not void, but it was wounded, and wounded trust in a fighting force is as dangerous as a wounded body. Varus organized his march with the tools he had left. He consolidated his units, pulling together the cohorts that had been most badly damaged and placing them where they could be supported by stronger units on either side. He put his best remaining cavalry at the flanks, though the terrain made this almost meaningless. He may have attempted to narrow the column's profile, to reduce the length of the snake, to keep his forces more concentrated and mutually supportive, to avoid the catastrophic isolation of units that the previous day had produced. He could not narrow it enough. The logistics alone prevented it. Even having burned the wagons, he could not move. There were still wounded men who had to be carried. There were still the essential supplies, water, food, ammunition, that required transport. There were still the civilian non-combatants, the camp followers and servants and families who had been part of this column from beginning, and who could not simply be abandoned and who slowed everything down. The column was still long, still vulnerable, still moving through ground it could not see. The warriors in the hills had moved through the night. This is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the entire battle. Arminius's forces were not a static defensive line. They were mobile. They could move through their own forest faster than the Roman column could march on a road, because they were moving through ground they knew, without wagons, without formation constraints, without the grinding weight of full Roman armor and equipment. Where the Roman column took 2 hours to cover 3 kilometers in the mud, a Germanic warrior moving light through familiar forest could cover the same distance in 30 minutes. This man Arminius could do something that changed the fundamental geometry of the battle. He could be ahead of the Romans, not just to the sides, not just behind, ahead. He could select the next killing ground before the Romans arrived at it, prepare the position, have his warriors in place, and waiting before the Roman vanguard came around the next bend in the path. The Romans were not marching into an ambush. They were marching into a series of ambushes, each one prepared and waiting. Each one adapted to the specific geography of that section of the route. Each one designed to extract maximum casualties at minimum risk to the attackers. Day 2's terrain, from what archaeological evidence and geographical analysis suggests, was if anything more brutal than Day 1's. The corridor between the Wiensberg Hills and the northern marshland had not widened. In some sections it had narrowed further. The hills pressing closer to the edge of the bog, squeezing the passable ground to a width where a cohort could not deploy in any formation that resembled what the drill manuals prescribed. And the rain was still falling. The path, already damaged by the passage of the column's vanguard, by the hooves of horses and the wheels of wagons and the feet of thousands of soldiers the previous day, had deteriorated overnight. Fresh rain had turned churned earth into something approaching liquid mud in the lowest sections. Men slipped. Animals went down. A horse or mule that went down in that mud on that narrow path blocked the column as effectively as a fallen tree. And getting it up again, while spears came out of trees, was a task that killed more men than the spears themselves sometimes. The attacks resumed almost immediately after the column began to move. There is a documented pattern in the second day's fighting that the ancient sources gesture toward, and that military historians have analyzed at length. The attacks were no longer purely concentrated at a single point. They were distributed, simultaneous strikes at multiple points along the column, some heavy and sustained, some quick and probing. Enough to force a reaction, to pull units out of position, to draw Roman attention and resources, and then to stop, letting the column move forward a little, letting the anxiety build, before striking again from a completely different direction. This is psychologically sophisticated warfare. The sustained threat is terrible, but the alternating threat, attack, then silence, then attack again from somewhere unexpected, does something different and in some ways worse. It prevents rest. It prevents the soldiers from ever settling into even the grim routine of sustained contact. Every moment of quiet becomes its own kind of torture, because the quiet might end at any second, from any direction, and there is nothing to do but wait for it to end. The Romans fought back. This needs to be said clearly and with the respect it deserves. Accounts of individual Roman resistance during the second day suggest that the legionaries of the 17th, 18th, and 19th did not simply absorb punishment and die passively. Where the attacks came close enough to the path, where Germanic warriors pressed too hard and gave the Romans the close-quarters engagement that Roman training was designed for, the legionaries were still extraordinarily dangerous. The gladius, in oppressive bodies, was lethal. The Roman soldiers training for close-quarter combat, the short, controlled thrust of the enemy's unarmored midsection, the use of the scutum as a weapon as much as a shield, the shield boss driven into an opponent's face, the low body position that reduced the target profile, was built for exactly this kind of tight, brutal, personal killing. There are suggestions in the sources that some Germanic warriors, pressing too close or too eagerly in the initial shock of contact, discovered this to their cost. That Roman units, even badly depleted, even exhausted, even operated without clear command structure, could still form a wall of shields and make the advance of any group of attackers intensely, bloodily expensive. But the Germanic strategy did not require winning individual engagements. It required winning the accumulation of them. Every Roman soldier killed was a permanent subtraction. Every Roman soldier wounded was a burden on the men around him. Every centurion lost was a leadership vacuum that could not be filled. The mathematics of the second day were moving only in one direction. Somewhere in the middle of day 2, a secondary catastrophe unfolded. The auxiliary troops. Roman armies of this period routinely incorporated non-citizen allied fighters. Auxiliaries drawn from subject peoples across the empire, fighting under Roman command but maintaining their own weapons, their own fighting styles, and crucially their own tribal and cultural loyalties. Varus's column included Germanic auxiliary cohorts, Germanic men from tribes east of the Rhine who had been fighting under Roman command, living in Roman-style camps, drawing Roman pay. What happened to these men during the battle is a subject of genuine historical debate. Some almost certainly remained loyal and fought alongside the legions. But the ancient sources suggest, and it is consistent with what Arminius had been doing in the weeks before the battle, that a significant number of Germanic auxiliaries deserted. Some may have actively changed sides. In the confusion of the forest, with spears coming from the trees and the column in chaos, a Germanic auxiliary soldier faced a choice that no amount of Roman pay or Roman training could fully resolve. Fight for Rome against men who might be from neighboring tribes, men speaking languages close to his own, fighting under a leader he may have heard spoken of with something approaching reverence, or slip away into the trees and survive. Some slipped away. The defection of Germanic auxiliaries, even partial defection, was not merely a loss of manpower, it was a loss of intelligence. Germanic auxiliaries were, in practical terms, the Roman column's best eyes and ears in this terrain, the men most likely to read the landscape correctly, to hear something in the forest that meant more than rain, to recognize the specific silence that preceded an attack. As they thinned from the column, Varus lost more of the situational awareness he had never had enough of. The second day's march ended with the Romans at something close to the limit of what a disciplined force can endure. The casualties of day 2 were heavier than day 1. The organization of the legions, already damaged, had deteriorated further. Units that had entered the campaign with a clear chain of command were now functioning under improvised leadership. Options commanding sentries because their centurions were dead, junior tribunes making decisions that senior officers should have been making. The wounded were now numerous enough that their care was consuming a meaningful fraction of the able-bodied soldiers' attention and energy. Varus held a council that evening. We do not have a transcript of this council. What we have is the outcome of it, and from the outcome we can reconstruct something of its texture. The senior-most surviving Roman officers, the legates of the 3 legions, the military tribunes, the prefects of the auxiliary units, gathered and assessed their situation with the clarity that extreme danger sometimes forces on men who have been trained to think under pressure. The assessment was not good. They were still, despite 2 days of brutal attrition, a significant fighting force. Thousands of Roman soldiers were still alive, still armed, still capable of fighting, but the direction of travel was unmistakably downward. Each day in this terrain was worse than the last. The enemy showed no signs of exhaustion, no signs of supply and morale constraints that typically degraded a force over sustained engagement. The warriors in the hills were fighting on home ground, resupplied from their own settlements, motivated by everything that motivated men defending their homeland. They could do this indefinitely. The Romans could not. Some officers at this council argued, apparently, for breaking out, a concentrated push, taking the best remaining troops, the most coherent units, and driving hard toward the Rhine, accepting that not everyone would make it, but that some significant force could survive and reform. It was a brutal calculation, the kind that military commanders sometimes have to make, and it had logic behind it. Varus rejected it, or rather, he refused to abandon the wounded, the civilians, the non-combatants. Whether this was nobility or command paralysis disguised as nobility is a question historians have debated for 2,000 years and will never resolve. What it meant in practice was that the column would stay together. The column would march together. The column would try to reach the Rhine together, or die together. Day 3 began. The ancient sources converge on this final day with an urgency and a darkness that even 2,000 years of distance cannot entirely dilute. Cassius Dio, for all is removed from the events, conveys something in his account of the third day that reads like a record of irreversible collapse. The terrain on day 3 delivered the killing blow that the previous 2 days had been preparing. The natural corridor that Arminius had selected as his killing ground, the passage between the wooded hills and the northern marsh, reached in one section a point of maximum compression. The hills came down almost to the edge of the bog. The passable ground narrowed to something barely wider than a single wagon. The path, if it could still be called a path, was a strip of churned mud between a wall of trees to the south and an expanse of waterlogged, impassable marsh to the north. In this section, the Roman column could not advance in any kind of order. It compressed, rear ranks driving into front ranks, the whole mass of men and animals and remaining wagons jamming together in a chaotic press that made organized movement almost impossible. Men in the middle of this compression had no room to lift their shields above their neighbors' heads, no room to throw, no room to run. And from the wooded hillside to the south, from behind the turf wall, from the elevated position that gave range and angle and cover, the Germanic warriors poured fire into the mass below. Not just spears now, rocks, anything that could be dropped or thrown from elevation onto men who could not effectively raise their shields, who could not disperse, who were trapped by the geometry of the landscape into a single dense target. The Roman formations that had survived 2 days of attrition and still held some coherence now began, under this concentrated pressure, to fragment, not because the soldiers were cowards, because there is a physical limit to what any human being can endure in formation when the formation itself becomes the instrument of death. When standing together means dying together. When the discipline that was your strength becomes a mechanism of your destruction. Men broke. Not all at once. Not everywhere simultaneously. But the break spread. Units that had held for 2 days suddenly lost the invisible thread of shared purpose that held them together. And when that thread snapped, the men on either side felt it snap, and they broke too. Some ran north, toward the marsh. They died in the bog, swallowed by the same geography that had helped trap them, unable to cross ground that the Germanic warriors, who knew exactly which paths through the marsh were passable and which were not, could navigate at will. Some ran south, up the hillside toward the tree line, tried to escape through the forest. They were hunted individually, killed in the trees, far from their units, far from their training, far from everything that made them Roman soldiers rather than simply frightened men. Some fought where they stood, in the mud, until they could not stand. Publius Quinctilius Varus, in the final hours of day 3, made the last decision of his life. He fell on his sword. The Roman tradition of suicide before capture was not weakness. It was a specific cultural act with specific meaning. A Roman general who allowed himself to be taken prisoner became a symbol of Roman defeat that could be exploited politically, displayed in enemy victory parades, used as proof that Rome could be humiliated. Varus chose death over that. His senior officers followed him. The legate Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the prefect Lucius Aegius, others whose names the historical record has partially preserved and partially lost. When their general died, whatever remained of centralized command died with him. The slaughter that followed was not a battle. It was a harvest. The ancient sources describe scenes that are consistent with what archaeology would later confirm. Execution of wounded Romans where they lay, the capture of standards, the killing of officers and slaves and camp followers with thoroughness that suggests not rage but purpose. Arminius had not built this trap to wound Rome. He had built it to send a message, written in the destruction of 3 entire legions, that could not be misread. The Roman eagle standards, the aquili, the sacred symbols of each legion's identity and honor, carried by specially designated eagle bearers and defended to death by every soldier in the formation, were taken, all 3 of them. In Roman culture, the loss of Aquila was one of the most profound military catastrophes imaginable. These were not merely flags. They were consecrated objects, the spiritual embodiment of the legion itself. Legions that lost their eagles were not simply defeated. They were, in Roman eyes, annihilated, unmade. Their numbers were not reassigned to new legions. The 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, those numbers were never used again. They were retired permanently from the Roman order of battle. They became a kind of absence in the numbering system of Rome's legions. Gaps, wounds that could not be renamed. Survivors there were. The precise number is unknown. Perhaps a few hundred, perhaps slightly more. Men who had escaped in small groups during the battle, who had hidden in the forest and waited, who had been part of the cavalry units that had broken out on day one and fled. Some were captured and enslaved. Some were sacrificed in Germanic religious rituals, a detail in the ancient sources that carries its own terrible weight. The soldiers of Rome's most sophisticated military machine dying on Germanic altars to Germanic gods that Rome had never bothered to fully understand. A small number reached the Rhine, brought the news west, and the news they brought was so catastrophic, so fundamentally incomprehensible within the framework of Roman military confidence, that the initial reaction at the Rhine frontier was disbelief, then panic, then something that the Roman world had not experienced in a very long time. Fear. Real, deep civilizational fear. The kind that does not come from a battle lost, but from a certainty suddenly shaken. The certainty that Rome would always win. That the legions were invincible. That the empire's expansion was a law of nature rather than a human achievement that could, in a rainstorm in a German forest, in 3 days of mud and screaming, simply stop. On the Rhine, the Roman commander Lucius Nonius Asprenas moved quickly to secure the river line with the 2 legions he had available, anticipating Germanic crossing that never came. Because Arminius had not built a trap to launch an invasion. He had built a trap to demonstrate a boundary. The news reached Augustus in Rome. And here the sources give us one of the most famous lines in Roman imperial history. Augustus Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, the architect of the greatest empire the Western Hemisphere had ever seen, a man who had survived civil wars and assassinations and 30 years of imperial politics, received the news of Varus's defeat and reportedly began beating his head against the walls of his palace, crying out again and again, in words that Suetonius preserved more than a century later, the same desperate, uncomprehending plea, "Varus, give me back my legions." For nearly 2,000 years, the Teutoburg Forest was a story without a location, not metaphorically, literally. Historians, soldiers, emperors, and scholars knew the battle had happened. The ancient sources were clear enough about that. 3 legions destroyed, Varus dead, the eagles lost, the psychological devastation that followed. All of that was documented, referenced, debated across 2 millennia of European scholarship, but where, precisely, where in the vast, undifferentiated darkness of the ancient German forest had 15,000 Romans been swallowed alive. The ancient sources gave geographical references, but ancient geographical references were frustratingly imprecise by modern standards, references to rivers and tribal territories and relative distances that could be made to fit a dozen different locations depending on how you read them. For centuries, scholars argued. They proposed sites in the Lippe Valley, in the Osnabrück Hills, along various Rhine tributaries. They built careers defending their preferred locations and attacking other scholars' preferred locations. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was fought and refought academically across centuries of German and European historiography, without anyone being able to point to a specific piece of ground and say with confidence, "Here. It happened here." Then, in 1787, a British Army officer named Major Tony Clun was stationed in Germany near the town of Bramsch. Wait, that date is wrong and the correction matters. Clun was not an 18th century figure. He was stationed in Germany in the 1980s as part of the British Army of the Rhine, and he had a metal detector and an amateur's passionate interest in Roman history. This is, in its way, one of the more improbable origin stories in the history of archaeological discovery. A British soldier with a hobby, walking fields near a low hill called Kalkries in the Osnabrück district of Lower Saxony in the year 1987. The first thing his metal detector found was a handful of Roman silver coins. Not unusual, necessarily. Roman coins turn up across northern Europe with relative frequency. Evidence of trade, of Roman presence, of the long reach of Roman commercial networks. Clun reported his find to the local archaeological authorities, as he was required to do, and continued searching. More coins. Then more. Then objects that were not coins at all. A Roman cavalry face mask. Fragments of Roman military equipment. Lead sling bullets. Roman sandal nails. The distinctive hobnail pattern of the caligae. The military sandal worn by every Roman legionary, each one leaving its own small iron signature in the soil 2,000 years after foot that wore it had turned to nothing. The professional archaeologists arrived. Excavations began in earnest, expanding through the 1990s and into the 2000s, and what emerged from the ground at Caulcres over those decades of careful, painstaking work was not simply a collection of Roman artifacts. It was a crime scene. That is not hyperbole. That is a word that comes most naturally to the archaeologists who worked the site, because what the ground at Caulcres preserved, with a specificity and completeness that no ancient written source could match, was a physical evidence of exactly what had happened, where, and in some cases to whom. The topography of Caulcres confirmed, almost immediately, the geographical logic of Arminius's trap. The Wiehenberg Hills rising to the south, densely wooded. The great Caulcres are more to the north, the ancient marsh that had provided the impenetrable northern wall of the killing ground. Between them, a corridor of passable land approximately 100 meters wide at its narrowest point. Exactly the natural choke point that the ancient sources described. Exactly the geography that rendered Roman military superiority meaningless. And there, along the base of the southern hills, running parallel to what would have been the Roman line of march, the turf wall, the wall that Arminius had built. It was not immediately obvious to excavators what they were looking at. 2,000 years of weathering vegetation and soil accumulation had reduced it to a low, irregular mound, but careful excavation revealed its structure with remarkable clarity. A construction of sods cut from the hillside, stacked and compressed into a wall roughly 1 meter high, perhaps slightly taller originally, before 2 millennia of settling. Wide enough at the base to be stable. Built at an angle that gave the men crouching behind it a clear throwing line down to the path below, while keeping them below the sight line of anyone looking up from ground level. Behind the wall, the archaeologists found what the warriors had left there. The concentration of finds immediately behind the turf wall was extraordinary. Lead sling bullets, some of them inscribed. Germanic craftsmen had stamped names or symbols onto their ammunition, a practice documented elsewhere, but striking to see confirmed here. Framea tips, evidence of the elevated position, the prepared ground, the deliberate construction of the firing platform that Arminius had used to rain missiles down on the column below, and on the path below, and in the soil on both sides where the path would have run, the Roman dead. The human remains at Caulcres tell their own story, and it is one that even 2,000 years of distance cannot make purely academic. The bones found at Caulcres are not laid out in graves. They are not organized in any way that suggests burial, ritual, or commemoration. They are scattered, fragmented, found in clusters that suggest bodies left where they fell, or moved slightly by animals or water action the years immediately after the battle, but never formally interred. Some bones show cut marks consistent with the removal of flesh, evidence of the post-battle treatment that ancient sources described, the desecration of Roman dead that was both a cultural practice in some Germanic traditions and a deliberate psychological message directed at Rome. The skeletal remains are overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly of fighting age, overwhelmingly showing the bone density and physical development consistent with years of military service. These are soldiers, the bones of the legions. Some show healed injuries, old fractures that had mended, evidence of previous battles survived, and wounds recovered from before this final one. A man who had been hurt before, who had been patched up by the Legion's medical service, who had gone back to service and marched and trained, and carried his equipment through years of campaigns, and who had finally come to rest in this particular piece of German soil in the autumn of 9 AD. The distribution of finds across the site maps the shape of the battle with an eerie precision. The heaviest concentrations of Roman military equipment, lost, abandoned, or stripped from the dead, correspond to the sections of the corridor where the path would have been narrowest, where the compression of the column would have been most severe, where the geometric trap was most completely sprung. The sparser distributions in the wider sections of the corridor suggest the initial contact zone, where the column had slightly more room to react before being driven into the choke points. The coins found at the site have been analyzed in detail, and their date range is striking. The vast majority were minted before 9 AD. Many cluster around the last years of Augustus's reign. There are no coins from significantly after 9 AD, which is exactly what you would expect from a site that was a battlefield rather than a settlement. A single violent event leaving its material signature in the ground, and then being abandoned, the coins representing what the soldiers carried into the battle rather than accumulated over time. Among the most significant individual finds from Caulqueries is a fragment of a Roman face mask, part of the elaborate, slightly unsettling parade armor that Roman cavalry officers wore on ceremonial occasions. It is a beautiful, deeply strange object, a thin sheet of iron or bronze shaped to the contours of a human face, eye holes cut out, traces of what might have been silver or tin coating still preserved. It was not combat armor. Roman cavalry did not fight in face masks. It was status equipment, the kind of object that a senior officer might carry with his baggage as a mark of rank and achievement. That it ended up in a pit at Caulqueries, excavated from soil that shows evidence of deliberate deposition, suggests it was taken as a trophy and then buried. Perhaps in a ritual context, perhaps simply stored and never retrieved. It is, in its way, a portrait of Roman confidence destroyed, an object that announced Roman superiority, now sitting in a pit in a German field. The archaeological record at Caulqueries also confirms, in physical terms, the Roman attempt to organize a defensive response during the battle. In one area of the site, excavators found evidence of a hastily constructed Roman counterfortification, a ditch and rampart Roman type, clearly built under duress, clearly not completed. The ditch stops abruptly, mid-construction, in a way that suggests the men digging it either died before they could finish or were forced to abandon the work when the attack intensified. A Roman defensive project interrupted by the reality of the battle, overwhelming the intention to prepare for it. It is one of the most poignant single details from the entire site. The groove in the earth where Roman soldiers started to dig the ditch that might have saved them and stopped. There is, however, a significant and important caveat that honest accounts of Caulqueries must include. Not all scholars are certain that Caulqueries represents the entirety of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. The site is large and rich and clearly represents a significant Roman military disaster of roughly the right period. The coin evidence, the topography, the artifact distribution, all of it is consistent with the battle as described in the ancient sources. But some historians argue that the engagement was spread across a wider area than a single site can represent, that Caulqueries may be one killing ground within a larger, multi-day, multi-location event rather than a single definitive battlefield. This is a legitimate scholarly debate, and it should not be dismissed. The ancient sources describe a battle that lasted 3 days and covered significant distance, a column moving, however slowly and under constant attack, over the course of 2 days of march before its final collapse. A single archaeological site, however rich, may not capture the full spatial extent of that movement and those engagements. What Caulqueries almost certainly represents is one of the most important phases of the battle, likely the initial killing ground, the section of the corridor where Arminius's turf wall and prepared position inflicted the first massive casualties. But the dying that continued over following days in different sections of the terrain may have left its archaeological signature in other locations that have not yet been found or fully investigated. The search continues. The landscape of the Osnabrück region, examined now with ground-penetrating radar, aerial survey, LiDAR mapping that strips away vegetation to reveal the shape of the ground beneath, continues to yield new information. New find spots are identified and assessed. The archaeology of Teutoburg Forest is not a closed book. It is a book still being written, still being corrected, still surprising the scholars who are writing it. But even in its incomplete state, what Caulqueries has given us is something that the ancient sources, for all their detail and drama, could not quite provide: the human scale of it. When you read Cassius Dio's account of the battle, or Tacitus's description of what the Roman general Germanicus found when he visited the site 6 years later, and we will come to that visit, because it is one of the most haunting scenes in all of Roman literature, the numbers are almost abstract. 3 legions, 15,000 men. It is too large to feel entirely real. But when you hold in your mind the image of a single Roman hobnail, corroded green-black with 2,000 years of soil contact, pulled from the ground to the exact spot where a man's foot last pressed into German earth, the abstraction collapses. The number becomes a person. The history becomes a death in a specific place, in a specific morning of rain, and screaming that was that person's last morning. That is what Calcres gives us that no text can. The physical, irrefutable, specific evidence of individual human beings meeting the end of their individual human lives in a narrow corridor of German forest, in the service of an empire that never fully recovered from losing them. There is one more scene from the archaeological record of Teutoburg that belongs in this chapter, and it comes not from the excavations at Calcres, but from the ancient literary sources, specifically from Tacitus, writing about events that occurred 6 years after the battle. In 15 AD, the Roman general Germanicus, nephew of Tiberius, one of the most celebrated commanders of his generation, the man whom many Romans hoped would be the next emperor, led a retaliatory campaign deep into Germanic territory. He fought several significant engagements. He recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards, which was treated as a major Roman triumph, and he visited the site of Varus's defeat. What Germanicus and his soldiers found, 6 years after the battle, had not been touched. The Germanic tribes had left it as it was, perhaps as a monument, perhaps as a warning, perhaps simply because there was nothing there worth disturbing. Tacitus describes what the Romans saw. Bones, everywhere, bleached and scattered across the open ground, piled in places where men had made a last stand, heaped near the positions where the officers had died. The fragments of weapons, the remains of the altars where Roman prisoners had been sacrificed, the skulls of Roman soldiers nailed to the trees that lined what had been the column's route of march, a row of dead faces watching a forest path, 2,000 skulls in the trees. For 6 years, Germanicus's soldiers wept. These were professional Roman soldiers, hardened men who had seen battle and death and the wreckage of war many times. They wept. They buried the bones. All of them, indiscriminately. They could not identify individuals after 6 years of exposure, and it did not matter. They built a burial mound, and they interred the dead of 3 legions in it, and they performed the rites that Roman religion demanded for the dead, and they wept while they did it. Tacitus notes that Tiberius, back in Rome, received this news with some discomfort. The concern was religious and political simultaneously. Soldiers were not supposed to bury the dead of a foreign legion. There were ritual complications. And politically, the emotional spectacle of Roman soldiers weeping over Roman bones in Germanic territory was not the image of imperial confidence that the emperor wished to project. But Germanicus had felt something, standing in that field, that overrode imperial image management. Something that 2,000 years later, standing in the museum at Calcres and looking at the objects pulled from the soil of that corridor, the face mask, the coins, the hobnails, the bones, you can still feel the specific weight of a civilization's nightmare, preserving the earth it could not conquer. Empires do not announce the moment they stop growing. There is no declaration, no ceremony, no single day on which the maps are redrawn and the ambitions officially reduced. Empires contract away glaciers retreat, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the leading edge pulling back while the mass behind it insists, for years, for generations, that expansion is still the direction of travel. But there's always a moment, a specific event, a specific defeat, a specific place where the ice stopped advancing and began, slowly, to pull back. A place where the empire's idea of itself collided with something it could not overcome, and where the collision left a mark that never fully disappeared. For Rome, that place was a corridor in the German forest. That mark was Teutoburg. To understand what the battle did to Rome, not just militarily, not just politically, but psychologically, civilization ally, in the deepest part of its imperial identity, you have to understand what Rome had believed about itself before the autumn of 9 AD. Rome believed, with a complete conviction of a civilization that had not been seriously checked in several generations, that its expansion was essentially inevitable. Not arrogant, necessarily, though arrogance was certainly present, but inevitable in a way that the Romans understood their own history, their own divine mandate, their own destiny as the organizing principle of the known world. Augustus had given this belief its most eloquent expression in the Aeneid, the great national epic that Virgil had written in the previous decade, in which Jupiter himself pronounces Rome's empire as having no limits in space and no end in time. Imperium sine fine, empire without end. 3 legions died, and that sentence developed its first crack. The immediate military response was, by Roman standards, extraordinary. Augustus mobilized reserves that had not been called up in years. He extended the terms of soldiers whose service had already concluded. He pressed freedmen, technically ineligible for military service under Roman law, into emergency units. He stationed additional forces along the Rhine with an urgency that the Rhine frontier had never previously required. Valerius Paterculus, a Roman historian who served in the military during this period and whose account is one of our closer contemporary sources, described an empire in genuine shock, moving with the speed of an organism responding to a wound it had not anticipated receiving. Tiberius himself was sent to the Rhine, the most experienced general available, to stabilize a frontier that Rome suddenly, terrifyingly, was not certain it could hold. It held. The Rhine held. Arminius did not cross it. This was, as noted earlier, not his intention. The trap had been built to destroy, not to invade, to demonstrate a boundary rather than to launch a conquest. The Germanic tribes east of the Rhine were not in a position, and arguably not interested in, a sustained offensive campaign into Roman territory. They had won what they wanted to win. The Romans could keep their side of the river. The forest was not for sale. Rome stabilized. Rome recovered, in the administrative and military sense. Within a few years, new legions had been recruited and trained to replace the 3 that had been destroyed. The Rhine frontier was reinforced, organized, permanently garrisoned. The Roman war machine, damaged but not broken, reasserted its presence along the river line with a methodical efficiency that was its defining characteristic. But something had changed, something that cannot be measured in legions or in kilometers of frontier, but that shows up clearly and consistently in the decisions Rome made about Germania for the next 4 centuries. Rome stopped trying. Not immediately, not in a single, acknowledged decision. There were retaliatory campaigns. Germanicus's operations in 15 and 16 AD penetrated deep into Germanic territory, won significant battles, recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagles, and, if the ancient sources are to be believed, inflicted serious casualties on the tribes that had participated in the Teutoburg ambush. The Marsi were devastated. The Bructeri were attacked. Arminius himself was fought to at least tactical draws on several occasions, and the Germanic coalition he had built began to fracture under the pressure of Germanicus's campaigns. As coalitions build on personal charisma, and shared crisis often do when crisis becomes an ongoing war of attrition rather than a single brilliant stroke. Tiberius recalled Germanicus in 16 AD, recalled him at the moment when many Romans believed one final, decisive push might actually complete what Augustus had intended, the conquest and permanent pacification of Germania. This recall is one of the most debated decisions in Roman imperial history, and it deserves a moment's serious attention, because it is not simply a story of timidity. Tiberius had reasons. The campaigns were expensive, extraordinarily expensive in men and material and money, to sustain at the distances they require from the Rhine supply base. The supply lines were long and vulnerable and had already been demonstrated, catastrophically, to be exactly the kind of logistical exposure that Germanic warriors knew how to exploit. Germanicus's victories, while real, had not produced a settled, pacified province that Augustus had envisioned. Every battle won was followed by another battle required, because there was no fixed infrastructure to hold, no cities, no roads, no Roman administrative framework that could survive the withdrawal of the army and keep the territory Roman. Germania was not like Gaul. Caesar had conquered Gaul in 8 years because Gaul had cities, trade networks, an agricultural surplus, an aristocratic class that could be integrated into Roman administration, and a geography, relatively open, cross-cut by navigable rivers, that Roman roads and Roman organization could colonize. Germania had none of those things, or had them only in embryonic, insufficient form. Conquering Germania, in the sense of making it permanently Roman, would require not just military victory, but a generation or more sustained occupation, enormous permanent garrisons, and a construction from scratch of the Roman civic infrastructure that made a province governable. Tiberius looked at the cost, looked at what happened to Varus, and made a calculation that proved, in hindsight, to be one of the most consequential strategic decisions in Western history. Not worth it. The Rhine, already fortified, already defended, Already the administrative boundary between Roman and non-Roman territory in the northwest would remain the boundary, the territory east of the Rhine, the territory that Augustus had intended to make a Roman province, the territory that Varus had died trying to administer, the territory where Arminius still lived and still fought, and eventually died at the hands of his own people, would not become Roman. It would remain Germanic. Sit with that for a moment. Sit with the full weight of what that decision meant, not just for 9 AD or for the Roman Empire, but for the civilization that came after it. The Roman Empire, in its western half, eventually collapsed. The process was long, complicated, and much debated, and the simple narrative of decline and fall obscures an enormous amount of complexity. But collapse it did, over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries AD, under pressures both internal and external that the empire ultimately could not manage. What replaced it, in the wreckage of the western provinces, was a patchwork of successor kingdoms built by the Germanic peoples who had spent 5 centuries pressing against the Roman frontier. The Visigoths, the Franks, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, the Lombards, the Saxons, all of them Germanic, all of them, in the broadest sense, cultural descendants of the same tribal world that Arminius had defended against Rome in 9 AD. And here's the thing that gives Teutoburg its civilizational significance, the thing that elevates it from a military disaster to a hinge point in the history of the world. If Rome had succeeded in conquering and Romanizing Germania, if Tiberius had not recalled Germanicus, if the campaign had been completed, if the Rhine had ceased to be the frontier and the territory east of it had become as Roman as Gaul or Hispania or Britain, the map of Europe would have developed differently in ways that are staggering to contemplate. The Latin language, which became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, the Romance languages that between them are spoken as a first language by nearly 1 billion people today, would have spread east of the Rhine. The Germanic languages, German, Dutch, English, the Scandinavian languages, their character, their grammatical structure, their vocabulary, to the fact that the peoples who spoke Proto-Germanic were never fully absorbed into the Latin-speaking Roman world. They remained linguistically and culturally outside it. They developed differently. And when Rome fell and those peoples moved into the former Roman territories, they brought their languages and their cultures with them, mixing with the Romanized populations already there to produce a specific linguistic and cultural hybrid that we call medieval Europe and that we still inhabit. The border that Tiberius drew along the Rhine in 16 AD, the border that Arminius had effectively forced Rome to draw 7 years earlier, is a faint ancestral outline of a border that still exists in some form today, not in political terms, not in any simple direct line. But the deep cultural distinction between the Romance language world to the southwest and the Germanic language world to the northeast, a distinction that shaped European politics, religion, philosophy, literature, and identity for 1,500 years, has its roots, tangled and complicated but real, in the fact that Rome stopped at the Rhine. Because 3 legions died in a German forest. Because a man with 2 names decided to use everything Rome had given him to destroy the empire that had educated him. The long shadow of Teutoburg does not end there. Within Rome itself, the battle produced a psychological wound that proved remarkably resistant to healing. The lost eagle standards haunted the imperial imagination for decades. 2 were recovered under Germanicus. The 3rd was not recovered until 41 AD, more than 30 years after the battle, when an unrelated military operation stumbled upon it in a different tribal territory. 31 years of missing sacred object, a missing piece of the empire's dignity, a number, 19, the 19th legion, that could not be reused or reassigned because doing so would mean acknowledging that the original legion was gone and could be replaced. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were retired. Permanently. They are absent from the Roman legionary order of battle for the rest of the empire's existence, an absence that any Roman officer reading the list would immediately recognize and feel. A set of gaps in a sequence that should be complete. The mathematical signature of a catastrophe that could not be undone. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century AD, returns to Teutoburg with a frequency that suggests it was not merely historical material for him, but something closer to a wound that his civilization kept touching. He is the one who preserves the image of Germanicus's soldiers weeping over the unburied bones. He is the one who gives us the most detailed account of Arminius's later career, the political infighting, the tribal conflicts, the gradual erosion of the coalition that had seemed so powerful in 9 AD, the eventual assassination. And in his portrait of Arminius, there is something genuinely complex, an acknowledgement, rare in Roman literature, about external enemies of greatness. Tacitus calls Arminius, explicitly, the liberator of Germania, liberator Germani, not a barbarian chieftain who got lucky, not a traitor, who deserved whatever came to him, a liberator. The specific word that in Latin carried the highest possible civic honor. The word applied to men who freed their peoples from tyranny. This from a Roman historian, writing in Rome, about the man who destroyed 3 of Rome's finest legions. It is one of the most striking sentences in all of Latin literature, and it tells you something about how deep the mark of Teutoburg went. Deep enough that even 2 generations later, Roman writers could look at a man who had inflicted the worst military defeat in their empire's history and find in him something worthy of a word usually reserved for Roman heroes. There's a final irony to the story of Arminius that history has preserved, and it is a kind of irony that real history produces far more often than tidy narratives prefer. Arminius spent the decade after Teutoburg fighting. He fought the Romans in the campaigns of Germanicus, inflicting casualties even as he took them, never losing decisively, never winning decisively. The war grinding on in the German forests, a particular inconclusive brutality of insurgent warfare in difficult terrain. He fought rival Germanic leaders, including his own uncle in Guiamarus, over questions of strategy and power. He fought, most damagingly, the political consequences of his own success, because the very power that defeating Rome had given him made him a threat to the Germanic tribal leaders who had allied with him, men who had wanted to free Germania, but not necessarily an Arminius-led Germania. His father-in-law suggests the man who had warned Varus, the man who had handed Dusnelda to Tiberius, remained a thorn in his side throughout, a living symbol of the genuine division within Germanic society about whether Rome was an enemy to be expelled or a civilization to be negotiated with. And in 21 AD, Arminius was killed, murdered by members of his own tribe, the Cherusei, by men who feared that his growing power was becoming the very thing he had fought to prevent, the domination of one authority over the free peoples of Germania. He was approximately 37 years old. He died without seeing his son. He died before the third eagle was recovered. He died in the political wreckage of the coalition he had built, at the hands of people who owed their freedom, in a very direct sense, to what he had done. The man who had used Rome's own tactics against Rome was destroyed, in the end, by the same force that had ultimately limited Roman power in Germania, the fierce, ungovernable independence of a people who would not submit to any single authority, however much they might need one. There is a lesson in that, perhaps multiple lessons. We began this story in a rainstorm, with a 23-year-old legionary, wet and tired, hearing something in the trees that his training had not prepared him for. We began it with an empire at the height of its confidence, marching into a forest it did not understand, guided by a man it should not have trusted, toward a fate it could not have imagined. The story of Teutoburg is, at one level, a story about military strategy and geographical determinism, and the extraordinary individual brilliance of a man who managed to hold 2 identities simultaneously and weaponize both of them. It is about the limits of empire, the arrogance of power, the way that institutional confidence can become the very instrument of institutional blindness. But it is also something simpler and more persistent than any of that. It is a story about what happens when a civilization forgets that the people it is trying to absorb into itself are people, with their own history, their own gods, their own idea what freedom means, their own reasons as serious and as human as any Roman reason, for resisting the assumption that Roman civilization was something that ought to be imposed on everyone it reached. Varus did not fail because he was stupid. He failed because his entire world had taught him that what he was doing was obviously correct and obviously desired, and that the people receiving it were lucky to have it. He could not see Arminius clearly because his framework for understanding the world did not have adequate space for the possibility of what Arminius actually was. That blindness, the blindness of an empire to the genuine interior lives of the people it governs, is not a Roman problem. It is not an ancient problem. It is a human problem, and it has been the undoing of empires from Rome to present day, with a consistency that should make anyone who studies history genuinely uncomfortable. The forest took 3 legions. The forest held the line. The forest drew, in blood and mud, and 3 days of rain, a boundary that Roman power never truly crossed again. And on the other side of that boundary, the languages and the cultures and the peoples who would eventually become the nations of Northern Europe continue to develop along their own lines, in their own direction, shaped by their own choices rather than by Roman conquest. The map of the modern world is, in ways both direct and indirect, too large and too tangled to trace cleanly, a consequence of what happened in that corridor. The languages you hear on the streets of Berlin and Amsterdam and Stockholm and London, the legal traditions of Northern Europe that diverge from the Roman law that organized the South, the religious history of the Reformation, which erupted in precisely the cultural zone that Rome never absorbed, the idea of Germany itself, which 19th century nationalists like the men who built that enormous statue in the forest tried to root in Arminius, tried to claim as a founding myth of German identity, with all the complexity and danger that nationalist myth-making always carries with it. All of it, or something like all of it, touched in some measure by 3 days in a German forest in the autumn of 9 AD. Augustus Caesar beat his head against the walls of his palace. Give me back my legions. He never got them back. Nobody does, in the end. The moments that change history, the decisions made, and the traps sprung, and the warnings not heeded, and the signals missed. They did not give themselves back. They accumulate instead, layer by layer, generation by generation, into the world that we inherit and inhabit and mostly fail to see clearly, because we are inside it, the same way Varus was inside the forest, surrounded by things we do not know how to read. What Teutoburg gives us, if we are willing to look at it honestly, is not just a story about Rome. It is a mirror, one that has been sitting in the earth at Caugries for 2,000 years, waiting to be dug up, and everything it reflects is still recognizable.